So this chapter is chapter 12 about text. We definitely need to be able to style our text. Text has always been a core component of the web, and it continues to be, even though people don't read and we don't want to put that much text on our sites. We still want to put some text. The book does go through and tell you a lot of terminology, more than I think you probably care to know. If you're going to be like a graphic designer, then maybe you would want to know some of these terms. This one, I think, is appropriate. So serif is a fancy old word that means thingy. So a serif font has little thingies on the letters. Do you see the little thingies here and here and here? Whereas sans serif, sans means without, so sans serif means without little thingies. And you'll see that sans serif fonts are those that don't have little glyphs, little decorations on the edges. Does that make sense? So this is kind of the main distinction that is made between fonts, whether something is serif or sans serif. And really, I think the history here is when there are fonts like this with the thingies begin to establish lines. Do you see how the shape of this reinforces that there are lines? And I think maybe they were, historically, serif fonts have been used way older, like old style print was more serif. And sans serif has been used more in digital things, but they're all intermixed. Another broad class of font, the book calls monospace. And in most fonts, like you see on the left and right here, letters take up different amounts of space. So like an I is much narrower than an M. In a monospace font, every letter takes up the same amount of space. And what has arisen is that these monospace fonts look more like code. That's like typewritten stuff, which is what has been correlated with code. Now, the book goes through and talks about all these different terms. This is specifically the stuff that if you're like a graphic design, typography nerd, you might want to know this stuff. I think it's less relevant for regular people, but apparently this parts of a font, parts of a letter that go below the baseline are called descenders. This is called the cap height, which is basically like the height of a capital letter, but sometimes some letters go above the cap height. You see this, and those parts would be called ascenders. I think baseline is a pretty important term, and you do even see that on the web. Some of these things you don't even see on the web at all, but the baseline is, as if you could draw a line under where you would have drawn it if it was on a piece of paper. Some people might call this the X height, which is kind of the height of a lowercase letter. And well, we might see that some in web design. So here are some additional typeface terms. Types have different weights. Light, medium, bold, black are words. On the web, these are going to be defined in numbers between 100 and 800 and 900. Sometimes we have styles like italic, especially. And some fonts, you could say, have a stretch property, which is how condensed or stretched they are. Usually you're going to have a completely different version of the font that is more condensed or more extended, more stretched. Or you'll have to get a completely different font, but this is sort of a property of the font in general. Okay. Historically, the only fonts that you could put on a website were fonts that were installed on the user's computer. Right? And you are not the user, right? The user is not the designer, but the person who's looking at your site. And because of that, you had a very limited set of fonts that you knew were installed on pretty much everybody's computer, whether they were running Windows or Mac or iOS or Android. Now, that's really freed up lately, but you'll still see that these fonts are the ones that are still installed on all the operating systems. And so they will work kind of for free out of the box without doing anything special, without asking the user's computer to load a new font, which is what we're going to learn how to do in a little bit. So the Arial, Verdana, Helvetica, you can very confidently use. And when you ask the user's computer, instruct the user's computer to use that font, it will work because it's installed. Here's the Courier New is also a monospace font that's installed. CSS does define these like broad types of fonts, like serif and sans serif and monospace and cursive and fantasy. On the whole, this is not just on the whole, never, do you hear me? Never say cursive. Because if you say cursive, what the user's computer will likely do is use Comic Sans. And Comic Sans is the worst font in existence. It should never be used for any reason. There are no exceptions. There's some people that want to have a kind review toward it, but I am telling you, never, ever, ever use it. Okay? Don't use Comic Sans. If you use Comic Sans, you are saying, I would like to look unprofessional and be mocked and not taken seriously by anyone who looks at my site. That's what you're saying. And you never want to say that. So don't go there. So there is a second font that you should never ever use as well. It's not quite as bad as Comic Sans, but it's up there. And basically there's no reason to use either of these. So Comic Sans, which looks like this, it should just never be used. Like, I know you're thinking, what if I'm making a website for children, about children, that will only be seen by children? And I'm saying, I don't care. There's no, do you want to look like an unprofessional, clueless, no style, no self-respect child? No, you don't. So don't use Comic Sans. Likewise, we're not going to use Papyrus because Papyrus has been severely overused by anybody who wants to look a little earthy, tribal, maybe even Bible-y. Very popular with preachers is the Papyrus. It should not be used, ever. Okay? There's no excuse. Don't use these fonts. You're not going to do it, right? What's a good alternative? If you want a good baseline font, this is what to type in. System-UI. This isn't a specific font. This is saying use the font that's the default font for whatever operating system you're on. So that would be Android, iOS, Windows, Mac. And they all have a modern font that the user is already used to because it's the font that the system uses. And I promise you, it will look better than the Times New Roman that the web page defaults to. So if you need a good baseline, this is here. And what's nice about it is it's already on the user's computer, so it's going to load as fast as possible. It's also going to give you lots of variants where you can put in weights of all the different sizes. So you can be super, super light to super, super thick, dark, heavyweight. How do we specify fonts? It's with the attribute name font family. Font family. Font family? So it's font family. It's not font. It's not typeface. It's font family. I think I already mentioned this because it just comes up so early, but the font family property is peculiar. It's unique in that it takes multiple values, and the second and third and fourth values are just fallback values in case the first one doesn't work. In reality, there's no way somebody doesn't have Georgia installed realistically, so it would never go back to Times. I do think it's okay. This last one isn't a font, but it's a whole font family, or like a whole type of font. And I see it's okay to put that as a fallback, especially if you're using custom fonts, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Same for this second one. There's no way Arial is not installed on the computer, the phone, whatever. So Verdana, I think, is never going to be realistically hit. Note this bit here. This is true of all CSS values. If the value has a space in it, which most commonly happens in font names, then you've got to put it in double quotes, okay? So you can always put it in double quotes if you want to, but if there's not a space, you don't have to. If there is a space, you must, okay? So if there's a space, put it in double quotes or it might not work. This looks ugly, but what they have shown you here is this is a different font, this is a different font, this is a different font. The paragraphs versus the headings versus this authorship thing. How do we specify the size of the type? This one makes a lot of sense. It's font size. When we specify the size of things in CSS, there are several different units of measurement. One unit is the pixel. This is sort of almost the most restrictive, the most precisely defined. It's very absolutely defined based on the pixel size on the screen. You can also specify things in percent, and that would be a percent of what it should be based on its kind of where it is right now, based on its parent. On the whole, I would not ever recommend sizing fonts in percent. There are the sizes of boxes I would do in percent, but for fonts, I think the best unit is actually not on here, but it's called a rem. That's a REM. And essentially, a rem is a percentage of its base size based on a sizing that's defined in the root of your document or in at the very start of your document. So this stands for root M. Essentially, an M is the size of a capital letter M. We called that the cap height on that previous slide. So an M is how tall the uppercase letter should be. So by making this a font size of 1.3 M, then it's 30% bigger than it should be at kind of 100%. Does that make sense? So it's a sort of a scaling where 1.0 would be the size it should be. So M's are a really good M's are really good for font sizes. They have this weird scaling thing where if you had a box, and in this box you said the font size was 1.5 M's for the stuff in this box, like this div, and then you had another box in here, and you said its text had a font size of 1.5 M, then the font size in here would actually be 1.5 times 1.5. It would be based on kind of the context that it's in. You see how this is gross? So if you happen to be, like, you kind of imagine on the whole page, you kind of imagine that the whole page, whatever it's defining its font size as, this is 1.0. You with me? So if you're just one level deep, then it is just one multiplication. 1.5 times 1 is 1.5, and that's probably what you want. So this is going to be 50% bigger than it should be. But if you have this nesting effect, so this is then 50% bigger than this, which is what, 0.75 more than this, which would be like 2.25, which is kind of gross to keep up with. A root M is strictly based on this. So if you make it a root M, that's a rem, that's why I just always use rem, then now these would both be exactly 1.5 times 1, they'd be the same. And then if I actually wanted this to be bigger, then I could just say, hey, I want this to be 2.5 rems in this particular space. That's probably deeper than you wanted to know, but that's why on the whole I would say use rems rims are going to be much more flexible. Okay, so we got pixels, we got percent, we got ems. There are several other sizes as well, which we'll learn when we get into the boxes. A long time ago, a long time ago, when people were just starting to print, they learned that they could, with some care, increase the sizes of fonts and they would look good together. And you see this, like maybe you've seen this before, if you do a subtraction here, 72 minus 60 is 12. 60 minus 48 is also 12. 48 minus 36 is 12. 12. That is not 12, right? I'm just saying, like, the relative difference between these is not a static number. It's a little bit more magical than that. And a long time ago, people created this scaling, these type scales, because they look good, they're pleasing to the eye, and it's probably a good idea to use a type scale instead of just picking numbers out of thin air that, like, in your mind look good. There's actually, I'll show it to you in a second, but we can go to a website that will tell us, hey, choose your base font size and then use a specified ratio, like the golden ratio, or some other ratio to increase the font sizes. So they all have this kind of this mathematical basis in how they're getting big or how they're scaling. But this is an old type scale. If you've ever used like just a regular Microsoft Word, and you click the font size and that drop-down box appears, you'll notice it's not every possible number. It's some type scale. How do you make something bold? You say font weight bold. So remember, bold is about weight. So that's the key word, is weight, to make something bold. So now they made this bold. By default, headings are already bold. If you wanted to make them non-bold, then you could say font weight normal, and it would take it back to a non-bold. You can also define font weights in numbers, like I said, between 100 and 900. How do you make something italic? Font style. I have trouble remembering this one, but this is what it is, font style, italic. So this would be, if you just want to control the style of text, meaning you don't have to use an I tag in your HTML. You can just make any text you want to italic that's not in an I tag. You can just say font style italic. You see this, they made that italic now. But it wasn't an I tag in the HTML. And I would make the case that if you are just making something italic for stylistic purposes, then you should do it in CSS and not HTML. What if you wanted to make sure that all of the H1s were in uppercase? Text transform is your tool in that case. So if you say text-transform, uppercase, it'll make it all the letters uppercase even if they weren't typed in uppercase. Likewise, you can make all the letters lowercase if you wanted them all in lowercase, even if that's not what was in the HTML. You can also capitalize the first letter of the words. So you see the H1 here is all uppercase, even though that's not what was typed in. Breed history is all lowercase, even though that's not what was typed in. And I think it's this guy that they put in capitalize that would then capitalize the B, the I, and the D. There is a text decoration property, which primarily is used to add an underline or get rid of the underline. By default, links have an underline, and if you say text decoration none, you'll get rid of that underline. I will say, I hate what they did here. Don't underline something on the web unless it's a link. That's what's in everybody's minds. Like, to me, I think this should be clickable, and it's not. They just underline it. Like even a book. Don't underline a book title. That's not. Was your instinct? Put that in italics. If it's a link, they'll underline it. How do you specify the line spacing? You know, like double spaced or 1.5 spaced. This is the CSS that does that. So line height, no, it's not spacing. Apparently it's classically called leading because they would put lead between the lines in old school typesetting. But I would just call this line height or line spacing. So line height. On this one, you absolutely always want to use rims or ems, because if you have, let's say you have a font that is, I don't know, let's say it's 20 pixels. And if you put the line spacing, let me not do it that way. I think if you put, this is text, okay? 20 pixels. If you put the line height here, oh, I did it like this, to be, say, 24 pixels, then you'd have 2 pixels here and 2 pixels here above and below the text. Does that make sense? So you could control this, but then if you later came back and were like, no, actually, I think I want my text to be 24. I want it to be bigger. Right? What you would do is you were designing. Now, these are the exact same, which means there is no space between your lines, and it'll look like super tight. Because if you had another line of text, it would be right there, exactly on top. You with me? So, because you might want to change things in the future, you absolutely want to put this at, like they did there, 1.4 ems or rims. Say, this is now 40% bigger than this text, which this text should also be defined in rims. So let's make this, does this make sense? So now you know that you've got 40% more line height than the size. If you wanted to make this double spaced, then you would say, hey, I want to make this a 2.0 if this is a 1.0. Now, if you change this font size here, the actual font size to be 1.5, if you wanted this to be double spaced, then you need to take this up to 3.0 as the line height. You could also look at it on your screen and change the numbers until they look right. But this is the math that's going on. Okay. There's a bunch of fancy stuff you can do, like adding space between letters and words. I very rarely have to do this, but if you want to do that, you can. Usually with letter spacing, you're going to put in a very small number. Like they put 0.2 em. I've seen this defined in pixels, where you can just say letter spacing is like, I mean, this is going to add 0.2 em between each letter, where an em is the size of one capital letter. So this is a fifth of a capital letter of extra spacing. I've also seen you could put in like -2, and if you put a negative number, then it would squeeze them together and they'd be closer together than they should, which might or might not look good. You see in this one, this is an example of word spacing. They're going to add an extra whole em between every word. This is in the credits. This is in the H1. So let's see if we can tell the difference. Ugh, yeah, this looks gross. But you see, it's obvious. You see the extra space between these letters and these letters. And then, ugh, this is so gross. Don't do this. There's like a giant extra space between every word. Right? Remember Jurassic Park. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. Here's a really common one as well. How are you going to align your text? You can align text to the left, to the left, to the left, to the right, to the right, or you can justify, or you can center. So left, justify, and center are the options here, and I'm saying pretty much never use justify, okay? Don't use justify. I know it seems like it would work, but what I'm saying is when you justify, have you ever done this? It puts unexpected space, they'll show you here, it puts unexpected spaces to make it so that both the left and right side are straight and non-jagged. And to me, you end up getting these snakes of extra space. So like, you see this guy? Like my mind wants to like find the path that goes through the extra spaces. You with me? In the end, I think it becomes more distracting than it's worth. I have been reading since, I don't want to brag, since I was a child. And I'm used to there being a jagged edge on the right side as an English reader. And I think people who read right to left are used to there being a jagged edge on the left. You don't have to save your users from that. It's fine. And I think that the extra space is actually worse. This unexpected, unpredictable space that it makes is worse. It's especially even worsened because you don't know how wide, often, the user's device is going to be. Once they squish down to mobile, and you've got just a few words across, and then it's having to stretch it out to justify it, it adds really awkward spacing. Just don't do it. Don't justify. You with me? It's not as bad as Comic Sans, but there's still no reason for it. All right, there's one other giant rule that I want to emphasize here, and we may kind of pause here. Don't center paragraphs. Don't center body text, copy. You can center headings. As soon as it's a sentence, my alarm bells are going off. And students insist on doing this. And sometimes I'm tempted to as well, but it's mostly students. So this is the thing that I have to repeatedly critique on sites. Here's the reason. I just mentioned it. You've been reading English since you were a kid. And you've been reading Spanish since you were a kid, and you learned, you start on the left and you read to the right. And then when you get to the end of this line, you jump back here to wherever the beginning was. When you center body text, it makes the first line unpredictable, like where you jump back to. It's not good for reading. You feel me? So just left align stuff that needs to be read. If it's a heading, then that's different because you don't, right? It's not a paragraph that you have to read and go back and go back. If it's body text, which that means it's a paragraph, then you should pretty much always make it left aligned if you're in a left to right speaking language. Are we feeling okay? So we're not going to use Comic Sans, ever. We're not going to use papyrus, right? No papyrus. We're not going to center body, copy, paragraphy text. And we're not going to justify text. Even though it seems like it's going to look so pretty to be straight on the left and right, we're not going to do it. You with me? Okay.